Thank you for the opportunity to share my research with you today. My name is Penny Rabiger. I'm a PhD student at Leeds Beckett University, just starting my third year. I've been the lead coach on the Leeds Beckett University Centre for Race, Education and Decoloniality's Anti-Racist School Award since its inception in 2020. I was a teacher for over a decade and I've been working freelance on anti-racism in schools for a number of years now.
Welcome to you to the NAPE YouTube site. Thank you very much for joining us and indeed discussing the PhD study you're doing at the moment. So fingers crossed it goes through and you're successful and it gets published and stuff like that. So I'm really excited about this. So Penny, tell me, what is your background? How did you get to this state of writing this PhD?
So I was a teacher for quite a while. Depends how long you want me to. I won't give you my entire life story, but I was a teacher and I taught in Jerusalem by some kind of weird constellation of events of backpacking and being a bit of a hippie. I ended up in Jerusalem, and I came back in 2007 with a family that I'd acquired along the way, and started working at the Key for school leaders, which was just a kind of idea, help set that up. And I've kind of worked. I haven't been able to be a teacher in this country because my qualifications somehow weren't seen as good enough, although I had 12 years of teaching. But I sort of noticed inequity, and my own children were going through the schooling system and they entered the schooling system as children who didn't have a grasp of English. They spoke Hebrew. And I kind of, sort of noticed what was happening for my partner who was working in university. And that kind of led me to be thinking about issues around social justice and also racial justice. In 2016, with a couple of Twitter friends, we set up the BAMEed Network, so the Black Asian Minority Ethnic Educators Network, and that kind of brought me closer again to understanding issues around equity and around, things that are holding Black and global majority teachers and leaders back, societal things. Nothing inherently wrong with those people, but it's definitely something inherently wrong with the way society puts up barriers and blockers. And from that, I started coaching on the Anti-Racist School Award at Leeds Beckett University. And after about a year of coaching, I contacted Professor Vinnie Lander, who wrote the award and who runs the Centre for Race, Education and Decoloniality. And I said, there's some really interesting themes coming through. I'd spoken to maybe about 50 schools, so it's about 50 hours of conversation. It's really interesting themes. Somebody should do some research. And she said, well, yes, somebody should. There's a couple of options. Maybe you and I could write some stuff together, but, that doesn't really benefit you because you're not in the kind of academic world. How about you think about doing it as a PhD? So I was like, oh, okay. That's how I kind of came to be doing this as a PhD.
Gosh, that's quite a journey you've just described to me. And now I completely understand why you made that journey to the point where you are now. Which year are you with your PhD? How many more years to go?
So I'm doing it full time alongside freelance work and a bit of volunteering and all sorts of things. But I'm in my third year now. And I'm hoping to have a first draft written by the end of this year.
Gosh, that's exciting. That's really very hard time to put it all together with that sort of time, that goal that you've set yourself for the end of this academic year. Excellent. Well, fingers crossed. Anyway, let's have a look at the research you've embarked on and what you found out. When I say so far, it sounds as if you've done most of it now. So if you could present that to us, we would be most grateful if you'd like to share that with us now.
Great stuff. I'd love to. Thank you. Okay, well, thanks, first of all, for the opportunity to share my research. I have explained, that I was a teacher for over a decade and what I've been up to since then. I'll give a bit of brief background to the kind of sequence of events that led some schools to notice racism and to the Leeds Beckett Anti-Racist School Award being created in response to requests for support from teachers and leaders. So in the spring of 2020, the brutal public execution by a white police officer of a black citizen, George Floyd, in the USA, brought this concept of structural racism into sharp focus for some students, teachers, and leaders of schools in the UK. And it compelled them to want to do something about racism in their institutions. And among the many responses to the seemingly suddenly revealed realities of structural racism in our public institutions, schools sought out structured programs, awards, courses, kite marks that could support them on their journey to learn about racism, to tackle race inequality, and to kind of distance themselves from being seen as complicit as racists. The study itself, so my research builds on my work over the course of 3 years with a group of around 100 teachers and school leaders whose schools chose to embark on this 2-year anti-racist school award programme designed and delivered by the Centre for Race, Education and Decoloniality at Leeds Beckett. And it outlines research into processes teachers appointed as award leads go through when engaging with structural racism within their own institutions. So the study itself is anchored in a phenomenological perspective. It's a small scale study. It seeks to answer 3 main questions, really. What happens to people who lead on anti-racism efforts in their schools? What are their motivations for embarking on it and for persevering with this award? And what are the expected and unexpected outcomes of this work? And so my study explores data gathered through semi-structured in-depth interviews of 90 to 120 minutes with 10 participants at various stages of leading their schools through the programme. And the transcripts of the interviews, I shared them with participants for validation following the in-depth interviews, but I also invited them to complete a reflection exercise by commenting on what stood out for them from the transcript of our conversation, because I wanted to get them involved in thinking about and analysing and considering, what we discussed from their own point of view. So this study it's framed within contextual realities of schools in England during the 2020s. And so that means it's influenced by history, geography, demographics, national, regional, and local politics. And though the number of participants is small, they span different geographies, a range of different racialized identities, different school phases, as well as different stages of the Anti-Racist School Award process. In broad terms, the epistemological approach of the study, so the way that I'm kind of framing it, is underpinned by something called social constructionism. So this kind of collective generation and transmission of meaning, which means I trust the people that I'm interviewing and working with to kind of understand the ways that we're shaped by our cultural experiences and to critically engage with it. And so that's why I asked them to look at the transcripts themselves and to feedback. So then I took the transcripts and I analysed them for identifiable themes and sort of read through them several times and coded them and identified broad themes and then kind of honed them down to even more kind of close themes. I want to just demonstrate some of the way that I've analysed it using the conceptual framework of critical race theory and also critical whiteness studies. So all my analysis is done with these 2 kind of conceptual frameworks really very much in mind. And there's a few basic tenets to CRT, so critical race theory, and CWS, critical whiteness studies. And I just want to bring them to life. I'll explain what they are and bring them to life with some of the findings. So first of all, that, you know, racism is normal. It's not some kind of aberrant, strange thing. It's permanent. And there's such a thing as kind of white ignorance to racism, and a thing called interest convergence, which I'll explain in more detail. I'll give a couple of illustrations of how that comes to play. So the first, race as a social construct. So it might even be quite familiar to you that race is socially constructed. It's an imagined set of physiological, psychological, and behavioral tendencies perceived as either good or bad, positive or negative. And these imagined associations are created by dominant groups. They were created to justify oppression, denigration, exploitation of colonized subjects. And so they were based on an assumed inferiority, lack of morals, a lack of capacity for self-determination. And two main underpinnings of critical race theory are firstly an understanding, to cite Kimberly Crenshaw, for example, of how a regime of white supremacy and its subordination of people of colour have been created and maintained. And secondly, a commitment to, and I'm citing Gloria Ladson-Billings here, to change the bond that exists between law and racial power, which is coherently transferred over into education and other social sites. So we also need to be thinking about another couple of terms that you might have heard about: intersectionality and anti-essentialism. So basically saying a group's experience, so one racialized group's experience, can't be described in isolation from other aspects of that person. Or in short, I never show up just as a woman or just as white. So nobody ever shows up just as their perceived race, class, or gender alone. And it's really important to differentiate between white people as a kind of socially constructed identity based on skin color and whiteness as a kind of racial discourse. So we're trying to kind of take out the individual and talk about the system of whiteness. And for many of my participants in my research, if not all of them, this social construction idea was their kind of starting point. So some were engaged in unraveling where that construct comes from and how some notions that they held about the significance and operation of race in staffing, curriculum, pedagogy, educational outcomes were a direct result of constructions of race that correlate with deficit narratives around potential and capabilities of Black and global majority people. So they kind of realized just how they accepted this as built into the system as educators, or they were trying to work around it. So sort of meeting that head on was really important to them. The second point is about this idea that racism is normal. It's not aberrant. It's not some kind of strange thing that comes and bumps into us. So, and I think what sets critical race theory apart and often makes it viewed as radical or contentious by some is that it views racism as inherent at all levels of social and political life, that it's socially constructed, and it's also reproduced within institutions, you know, such as schools. So critical race theory encompasses an acknowledgement of this complete racialization of daily life. To cite a brilliant scholar called Zeus Leonardo. So again, all of my participants saw the work that they were engaged in through the award as this kind of wake-up call to actually how embedded racism is and how usualized it is. And I'll illustrate this in a minute. And then the third concept is this permanence of racism. So Derek Bell, he wrote you know, a seminal piece of work called Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism. And it's one of CRT's founding statements. And it sets the scene that race is, to quote, permanently embedded in the psychology, economy, society, and culture of the modern world. So in other words, the civil rights movement fought and won some really important legislative victories, but it didn't lead to a post-racial society, right? And that poses a real challenge for anti-racism work, because the question will be whether advances around equal opportunity, representation, or diversity can do more than just kind of maintain racial inequities at manageable levels. So in some ways, the aim of anti-racism work isn't to aspire to the perhaps unattainable goal of a post-racial society within our lifetimes and this eradication of racism, but to kind of improve conditions where gains can be made. And if you think about doing anti-racism work in schools, you can't change the whole system within which schools sit. So you're going to have to improve conditions where gains can be made. So critical race theory posits that powerful elites in structurally racist societies don't reform willingly. No one wants to give up on their power and the way things are, the status quo. And my leaders on this award definitely found this during their work in schools. So just to pull out a couple of quotes from my in-depth interviews to bring it to life. You can see here that there's such a clear expression that racism, far from being only visible in its extreme forms or just, people calling each other horrible names, it's normal, it's not aberrant, it's in the fabric of every single thing. It appears in everyday life, it's ingrained so much that it looks ordinary and natural, and it's a permanent fixture. And consequently, for critical race theorists, the strategy becomes one of unmasking and exposing racism in its various permutations, to cite Ladson Billings again. So this created a sense for my research participants, for the people leading on this award, of racism as everything, everywhere, all the time, a permanent fixture, and that anti-racism needs to be embedded forever to mitigate that. So it's not just about working towards an award, and it shouldn't be just the time that that person is leading the school on it. It needs to be embedded forever. And that's what participants say that the structure of the Anti-Racist School Award actually provides them. It's this opportunity to unmask, to see racism in situ, and to develop strategies to protect against it. And interestingly, Nassar Mir writes about Derek Bell's concept of the permanence of racism, that there's no likely end to the struggle for racial justice, only the promise this heralds and the desire to persevere, even despite the knowledge of likely failure. And that brings up kind of feelings of prolonged collective mourning and melancholia arising in those committed to fighting for racial justice. So those Black Lives Matter street protests throughout the summer in 2020 injected a lot of the award leaders with this kind of new cognizance of perceived systemic racism crisis, an awakening to the kind of, affective and psychic impact of race and racism, not only on Black men at the hands of the American police, but in our own schools, maybe by our own hands, on our own students and colleagues. And that understanding of racism in that way brought some of the award leaders to acknowledge that racism isn't just a coincidental and unfortunate output of human social life. It's embedded in everything, everywhere, all the time. And it's about life and death, and it's going to have to be forever work. So that's one of the other things that I learned from my participants. And this is, what Nassar Mir refers to as this kind of cruel optimism of racial justice work, that we have to hold on to these pockets of hope and possibility while also knowing that we might never reach the end of our work. And then this white ignorance and interest convergence. So CRT theorists see race as this social construct. It's both visible, mainly to, Black and global majority people, and it's invisible to whites. And this it's what's called an epistemology of ignorance, or white ignorance, and it's instituted in the white dominated education sector in the United Kingdom, and that's central to the way that it produces and reproduces racism, right? Our schools are run by 96% white head teachers, 86% have of schools in this country have all white leadership, even in really multicultural areas. So interest convergence acknowledges that there are ways to help white people to see racism and even shift power relations, but it says that change will only happen if there are specific gains to be made for whites as a result. So interest convergence is rooted in the notion that interest in achieving racial equity only advances when the interests of those in power converge with those seeking change, and they feel maybe threatened enough to need to act, or there's a good business case for it. And so a critical analysis of whiteness, we need to bear in mind, it's not an attack on white people, but as David Gilbourne says, it's an assault on the socially constructed and constantly reinforced power of white identifications and interests, and an attempt to understand the systems that undergird racialized power structures which advantage whites. So critical race studies and critical whiteness studies are powerful ways to see clearly how white identities are created, they're co-opted, and they're mobilized through systemic power structures which uphold and maintain white supremacy and white interests within their infrastructure. Again, just to bring this to life around white ignorance and interest convergence in minds. So it's really important to explore in more detail what drives some education professionals and their school leadership towards anti-racist practice. And, you know, that's where we started. You asked me, well, how did you come to this? And whether they understand this as, you know, what drove them as a result of maybe pressure, or maybe a placatory act to create harmony, or a more radical move that's grounded in dismantling oppressive and discriminatory power structures in our schools, you know, schools that reflect a microcosm of wider society. So we can't tackle the whole of society, but we might be able to change things where we are. So asking, how did you come to be leading on anti-racism work in your school? Did you jump? Were you pushed? It elicits varied responses, and nearly all of them reference George Floyd's murder as a prime motivator, a pressure point, or a moment of awakening. And for some school leaders, the award is a way to show commitment, and it's a way to gain recognition as well for wanting to work against the status quo. And for white leaders who haven't had to notice before, the violence of race and racism can eventually jump them without necessarily pushing them to immediately act. So one participant says, you know, it was right around the time of George Floyd. But they also say, you know, the head teacher said, we need to hold fire on doing assemblies. We need to hold fire on doing this because we don't know how to talk about it. So it's sort of new to them. And one participant explains how racism that she noticed over a period of a decade at the school where she worked was often brushed off by her colleagues as oversensitivity or misunderstanding intentions. But after this George Floyd moment, racism is suddenly now visible, and colleagues of colour are asked to share their personal experiences of racial discrimination with other staff members. And this staff member was jumped by this sudden inappropriate interest in racial trauma. And she reflects on how poor her colleagues' understanding is and was jumped by their insistence. So she talks about, you know, how they want her to stand up in front of everybody and relive her trauma. And if she doesn't want to do it, then they'll read it out and she can just sit there. And she says, you know, I was like, no, it's not okay. And critical whiteness scholar Barbara Applebaum suggests that here we see a recentering of whiteness by sacrificing the needs of the marginalized to the needs of the systemically privileged. And another scholar, Paul Badenhorst, brings it even further and says it's a form of predatory white anti-racism, in fact, because there's this sort of state of addictive atonement which hinges on, and I quote, the suffering of Black and brown peoples that serves as an impetus for change among white people. And that's what's required in order to ensure such change. So this kind of voyeuristic trauma porn and needing to know about the lived experiences of racially minoritized colleagues in order to ensure that they'll be safe from harm going forward, they're quite different things, but they can become entangled. So these nuances of jumping, being jumped, pushing and being pushed, they're really significant. And just to wrap it up with some, conclusions. So my research findings document deep personal processes which each award leader experiences. And I'll just focus some conclusions on 3 key recommendations for the sector arising from my findings more broadly. So the first is really understanding the motivations for engaging in anti-racism work. And obviously I constantly go back to this and visit this myself, like, why am I doing this work? Deep understanding is really important. Deep understanding of the motivations for engaging in anti-racism work can support greater understanding of how race and racism are socially constructed, how they operate, and how they're reproduced in public institutions such as schools, and how structural racism is, as Stuart Hall says, just how things are, unless we make it our business to disrupt it. So individuals really should critically engage with and be grounded in their own positionality. So who are you? Where did you come from? How did you come to this? What are the things that influenced you as a human? And they should really engage in their positionality around race and identity. Although white people we often think, well, we don't have a race, we're just white, right? So you really need to dig deep to understand about being racialized as white and understand how it shapes you. So also you've got to realize that kind of locating that site of struggle within the individual shouldn't thwart an understanding of that social construction of race and reproduction of racism, because that weakens the potential for collective action against racism. So alongside that personal engagement with positionality, understanding the motivations for their school engaging with anti-racism work can be really pivotal as well. So understanding organizational reasons for wanting to work against structural racism can help schools and leaders avoid falling into well-trodden paths and traps such as savior complexes or wanting to do good or expending effort on distancing themselves from being perceived as complicit or trying to be not racist rather than anti-racist. The second part to that, really linked to that, is about racial literacy. So across the board, educators leading on anti-racism work haven't been furnished with knowledge about history, social movements, conceptual basics of racial literacy. It's been removed from teacher training since the 90s. It's not included in teacher training or CPD in general. And it's not included in some of the key places where teachers learn. So it's not included in work around literacy, around behavior management. It's all done through this kind of colorblind lens. So a fulsome curriculum for racial literacy could really support teachers and leaders' work in identifying what racist structures look like, and then systems, processes, and strategizing a way forward to develop anti-racist practice and praxis in themselves and in others. And also remembering that we stand on the shoulders of giants. It seems like since 2020, there's this thing called anti-racism, but where there has been racism, there's always been resistance and strategic organizing in opposition to racism. And racism constantly shapeshifts and reiterates itself to remain available as a societal organizing tool. So anti-racism efforts need to be informed, to be iterative and agile, based on a clear understanding of the formations and the operations of racism. And so a key element of racial literacy is knowledge about the specifics. What's race? What's racism? What's anti-racism? And how does that kind of shift over time? And what's the context of the UK? And then the final recommendation is about investment. So investment is really key. Investment, when I talk about that, I mean funding, time, resources, both material and in terms of personnel. They're essential for anti-racism efforts to take off to be sustainable and successful. So anti-racism can't be a kind of passion project, a project of a few members of staff with skin in the game or in their spare time. It needs persistence, it needs stamina, it needs to be a whole school endeavour, it needs to be part of professional standards for school staff, and it can't also be just top down or only driven from the bottom up. Anti-racism as a strategy for whole school culture change can't happen without that significant and sustained investment. And, you know, with those three key recommendations in place, anti-racism as integral to school processes, practices, cultures, and policies could become a reality where individuals and institutions can stay with the trouble despite that cruel optimism of racial justice work. And if there's a few sources here of people that I've quoted along the way and drawn on their amazing work. So thank you.
Penny, that was great and very clear, may I say. And I'm glad you shared the reference list with us. I'll also, if you don't mind, I'll copy it and put it in the description on YouTube as well. You kept on mentioning awards. In fact, that last page sort of hinted about the awards as well. Could you give us a little bit more detail, and perhaps I can have a link so we can in that to the award system. How does it work?
Yeah, so obviously it's not the only one, and there's a lot of good work going on you know, out there, but the Leeds Beckett Anti-Racist School Award is basically it's a 2-year program. Schools join it. We provide them with a kind of self-assessment diagnostic, which they complete usually in consultation with, you know, the whole school community, so staff, parents, carers, children, and so on. And then they have coaching at various points throughout that award. We provide some support in the form of online webinars and you know, interactive learning opportunities. But really they have to kind of set their strategy, their action plan, and work towards in the first instance, a bronze award. So they have to identify, you know, where does racism lurk? What are the ways that they might be reproducing? What interventions do they want to make? And then measuring some of the impact, emerging impact. And we expect them to go again after the bronze. So they keep that for 3 years. And within that time, they can go again for silver, which is more of the same, but also starting to lead locally on that work and network with others locally, and then gold to be leading nationally and potentially internationally on it as well. So sort of spreading the love, if you like.
That sounds like an award that all schools need to look at seriously. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Penny? I mean, it was there was a lot of information and detail in there. Is there anything that you thought, well, perhaps I need to mention that as well?
I don't think so. I mean, I think if, you know, if anyone watching is interested in learning more or wants to know where to start, then they can definitely get in touch either with the Centre for Race Education Decoloniality or with me. And I'm really happy to help people on that journey, or if they're already on that journey and they want to go deeper, I'm really happy to signpost. There's some amazing people out there leading on different aspects of this work, and there's lots of stuff to read and watch and listen to. Yeah. Good.
All part of the CPD process in schools, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And CPD can be listening to a podcast while you're hoovering, you know, it doesn't have to be sitting down.
Or even, dare I say, a YouTube video.
A YouTube video as well.
Penny, thank you very, very much indeed. I've thoroughly enjoyed the presentation and indeed speaking to you. I'll say goodbye for now, and you never know, we might hear from you in the future. Okay, bye for now, anyway.
Thanks so much.